Hello, new modelling shows abolishing negative gearing for new properties would save the budget $42 billion over a decade. The Greens are pushing the measure in a bid to help the budget black hole, while Labor says it's willing to look at modifying negative gearing rules. The government has no plans for any such changes. Joining me now is Sky News political reporter Tom Connell. Tom, hello again. And the Greens say this plan would be subject to a grandfather clause.
Yeah, and that's pretty crucial. That would mean that any investors currently with a negatively geared investment would not have any change in the future. It would only be investments after July 1. And if this is to be any chance of getting the approval of, say, Labor, that would certainly be a prerequisite. Now, I'm joined by the Greens housing spokesperson, Senator Scott Ludlam, who's over in our Perth studio. Senator Ludlam, thanks for your time today. And a little bit more about this policy if I can, because it's gone through the Parliamentary Budget Office. I'm interested, though, in whether or not the costings looked at potential change in behaviour, whether an investor might, instead of using negative gearing, go through superannuation tax concessions, maybe a family trust, and that you wouldn't get the full amount of the $3 billion over the forward estimates.
Yeah, the Parliamentary Budget Office costing does assume some changes in behaviour, although it doesn't go into where people might park their investments. And obviously you'd be aware the Australian Greens have some proposals on the table for superannuation tax concessions as well. But it assumes that, you know, it would take about 10 years, roughly, for negative gearing to be completely unwound from our tax system. And that's the basis on which we release the costings.
So that 10 years, though, does that mean people can still have investments longer than the 10 years if they want? That grandfather rule would be indefinite, infinite, or would it have? Are you talking about a cut-off period of 10 years for the grandfathering?
No, it's not a cut-off period, and we're very open to negotiation on the final form of the package. We just think it's time to get moving on it. The PBO estimated basically it would take about 10 years on the current rate of investment property turnover for it to wash out. It's still there residually, but that's why you end up with $42 billion roughly, and you've got to obviously be very careful with 10-year estimates as opposed to 2 or 3. That's a big boost to the budget bottom line, and we want that transferred immediately into emergency accommodation for people who are experiencing homelessness, and to start making a significant inroads on the social housing waiting list, particularly the emergency waiting list.
And what about for the ordinary supply? Have you done any work? There's a lot of theories out there that this could hurt supply, that investors no longer have access to this tax write-off, and perhaps supply is diminished and rents increase as well.
No, I mean, that theory's been more or less completely debunked. If you look back to when it was lifted, when negative gearing was lifted temporarily by Paul Keating, the sort of mythology goes that that prices spiked, rental prices spiked across the board, and of course that's not the case. The ABC's actually done quite a good job this morning on their fact checker of really demolishing that theory. Sydney went up because rental vacancies were less than 1% at the time. Perth was coming through the America's Cup. Vacancies here were about 1.5%. Stayed flat in Melbourne, actually declined in Brisbane. So it's negative gearing has more or less completely failed as a supply initiative, and what it's done instead is, I think quite perversely, the benefits are accruing to people in the higher income brackets, and I don't think it's appropriate or fair that low and middle income taxpayers should be subsidising that.
Okay. Ending this now, quite suddenly on July 1, albeit with grandfather rules, are you concerned about a very sudden correction? You've spoken about a housing bubble that can be in part addressed by this because we've got more and more investors using negative gearing, but there could be a pretty sudden correction possibly, and without a lot in the RBA's arsenal to go any lower on interest rates as well.
Well, I think that effect would certainly be blunted by the fact that you're not removing it from the system entirely, that you are grandfathering it, that people who have set up their tax affairs in that way, you're not removing the concession from them. You're saying henceforth it is no longer there. We took advice on, for example, whether you could phase it out or ramp it out over a period of time, and that distorts investor behaviour. So we think grandfathering is the way that it then kind of washes out of the system slowly over a period of 10 years or more. And the important thing is then what you do with the money. So we're aware that the budget is very tightly constrained at the moment. Housing supply is very tight. We think the way to increase supply is not this failed sort of investor strategy, but actually by direct investment through public housing, social housing and emergency accommodation for people suffering from homelessness. That's the way to boost supply, and that can have the effect of cooling the rental market as well.
You've spoken about wanting to avoid these tax perks you say to go to mostly wealthier Australians overall when you talk about the actual money. So what about, was there consideration about perhaps a more nuanced approach? You might limit how many properties one can have, how big the loss can be, rather than an across-the-board action, which would also affect some low and middle income earners using this strategy as well to build wealth for their family.
We don't have any problem at all with people building wealth for their family. It's that why would we ask other taxpayers to subsidise it? It's a really perverse incentive. You'll still be able to write off interest payments, for example, against your tax or other improvements to your property. Housing investors are still very, very well supported in our tax system. It's writing off that income and those rental losses against other forms of income that's actually perverse. We have no problem with property investment, but I don't think it's appropriate to force other people to subsidise it.
Okay, that's all that we've got time for today, but Scott Ludlam, thanks for your time today.
Good on you, much appreciated.
Thank you, Tom. Police have used pepper spray